interesting and controversial. It is controversial because over time we've been told that a conceptual framework is more handy, a conceptual framework is more precise, and a little bit less difficult and more charitable to work with. Today I want to contest this idea of a conceptual framework and interest you in the theoretical framework. The understanding here is, first, we are dealing with a high-level group, PhD. And as we did say, our emphasis has always been to find the philosophy in the PhD. And as we are going to go through, we want to make an argument that the philosophy in the PhD cannot be constructed through the conceptual framework. So today we want to resist the conceptual framework tradition, particularly for the PhD students you are, and then take us more into the theoretical framework. Now, once we start that way, then the next question is, what makes the theoretic framework, or what makes the theoretical framework a lot better than conceptual? We are not going to take time focusing on the conceptual framework because it's not important, but we are also going to show why it's actually not important. Today we want to deal with the theoretical framework. And the argument is that a conceptual framework is simply some concepts that are utilized to name a problem or to establish a problem, but without understanding the origin, without understanding the core thinking around it. We can give an example here, the concept of a state. Like Uganda is a state. But how shall we understand a state if we look at it simply conceptually? So, a state as a concept and also understood conceptually implies that we have a problem here. Because then the next question is, which tradition are we going to use to understand the concept of the state? With theoretical foundation, with theoretical path are we going to deploy to understand the concept of the state? So at the end of the day, we are stuck with the concept and we try to give some meaningful idea about what the state is, and we go into a massive scale of not just debate, academic debate, but argument, emotional confrontations. You don't know what a state is. I know what a state is. And we all begin to clamor for correctness or rightness of what we mean a state is. But if we use the theoretical foundations, the theoretical frame to understand the state, then we are at ease. And we say, okay, which tradition do you come from? And somebody says, I come from Karl Marx tradition, Karl Marx theoretical framework of a state. And what does that imply? That a state is a structure, an organ, or an institution that monopolizes violence. For very specific reasons. To maintain or to attract and retain power, to attract and retain resources. So then we begin to understand that your notion of a state has a very particular tradition, the Karl Marx or the Marxist tradition of the state. But you can also begin to pick from another tradition, Max Weber. And Max Weber will define a state in a very categorical way. A state must have an army or security. A state must have a population. A state must have a boundary. A state must have resources to self-sustain itself. A state must have norms and values that it cherishes, and on and on. Now you begin to see a radical shift in the understanding of the state from Karl Marx, Max Weber. But pretty much earlier, you had also the concept of the state discussed by Aristotle in his book, The Politics. And Aristotle does argue, first, he understands the state as a moral institution, a moral framework whose purpose is to lead people, the citizens, into a moral good, what he calls eudaimonia, which is happiness. And happiness here is not in a sense of laughter, that we are happy, but in a sense of fulfillment. The state is an institution, an organ that drives us towards a moral status. The state itself is moral. And so it's supposed to drive us as the highest institution of morality, has to drive us through the smallest or the basic unit of the family, through the state, to this end. So the state has a teleological end. And the end here is to build and sustain a moral order. So, in very simple words, the state is moral institution. But notice, that is not the definition of Karl Marx. So a Marxist would say a state is an instrument and an institution that monopolizes violence, uses violence, as a technique of governing, and it is itself. That means all of them are critically valid from the different theoretical traditions they come from. What that tells us, until we are able to get rooted, until we are able to get connected, until we are able to get grafted into the theoretical traditions, we are not going to understand the concepts we are going to deploy. And we use the state as a case scenario, is something we all are familiar with. And until we are rooted in a certain or a particular theoretical tradition, we would not have understood what the state is. So, what does that mean? That the state is conceptualized in various theoretical traditions. And that begins to tell you, to understand a concept, you need to deploy a theoretical tradition. And this is much more critical at our level of doctoral students. For all the areas that we are investigating, we are deploying certain concepts. But until we are able to root ourselves into certain theoretical traditions, we are not going to understand our problems that we are investigating. And we are not going to understand the concepts we are investigating. And that therefore tells us that we have to privilege theoretical framework over conceptual framework. To build this case, we want to use virtually three readings here. First, from Michel Foucault, on the concepts of archaeology and genealogy. So we have Michel Foucault. And we are looking at the methodology that he uses to arrive at the theoretical framework, and the methodology of archaeology and genealogy. We read Michel Foucault's archaeology and genealogy methodologically or epistemologically, because he wants to found a deeper theoretical underpinning to help us understand the problem and investigation of knowledge. And it can also start off by going at that level of what we are calling methodological, or in another sense, epistemological. So, why does Michel Foucault offer to use these two methodological points? First, archaeology is basically to do with a study of history or prehistory. What Michel Foucault is telling us there, that every concept, every idea is rooted in a particular history. It is rooted in a particular remains of history, human or scientific history. That the idea that you have is rooted to a certain history. The language that we speak, the words that we use, is rooted to a certain history. And history can either be the history of the as past or an earlier history of what you would call the prehistory. In whatever form, is saying that there is a connection in historical terms to concepts, words, and languages we use. Now, how do we understand this idea of history in view of our question of theoretical framework? He is saying, and you can link his idea of archaeology to his issue of structuralism. And Michel says, to understand structuralism is to go back to the question of structures. That all what we do, how we behave, even the food we eat, is connected to the structure in which we were brought. And one of it is culture, or tradition, the environment in which we are in. In other words, there is no behavior, there is no language, there is no character without a history. And instead of taking time to understand the language, take time to understand the historical or the context from which this behavior, this attitude, this language comes from. That is the meaning of archaeology. So instead of taking time on a concept, you have to understand the context from which this concept emerged, understood, and dynamically debated. You cannot lift a word. For example, we are talking about power, without understanding the history of power, without understanding the structures around power. How does power connect to politics? How does power connect to economics? How does issues of power connect to culture, to tradition, to class, to race, and on and on? If you pulled or picked a concept of power and placed it over here, interrogating what it is first of all dry. It has no context. It has no value proposition. And it is meaningless. Because every part of reality, Michel Foucault will tell us, emerges from a certain context, emerges from a certain history. To understand northern Uganda now, you are not going to say, well, I'm going to observe northern Uganda, and then I go with a telescope, or I go with my empirical data or a scientific approach, and bracket of history, bracket of events that took place in northern Uganda. Will you understand northern Uganda? No? That's the concept of archaeology. You must understand the history. You must understand the start point. So, Michel Foucault uses archaeology not conceptually. Even when it's a concept, it is used methodologically or epistemologically. The second concept that Michel Foucault uses is the idea of genealogy. Genealogy. We talked about genealogy. This is where you get the gene from, discussions around the gene. Genealogy is simply tracing of lines, lineage, or origin. Genealogy is the tracing of origins or lineage, or basically the line. Whether it's an origin issue, whether it is a lineage, the point is tracing. You have to trace backward. So you have a backward and a forward dimensions here, methodologically. You are dealing with the concept of power or even the state. You have to trace backwards. How did it start? Now, at that point of genealogy, Michel is not interested in historicizing a process. At a certain point, we are going to say the two seem to entangle. And we are going to argue whether archaeology or genealogy, there's an entanglement. We are coming to that. But analytically and methodologically, Michel is talking about tracing. And you trace, obviously, backward and forward. Which, in a sense, brings us to the question of context. It may not be historical context, but critical context, academic context, literary context. At a certain point, we are going to talk about literature review. We are saying, how has this concept emerged over time in the literature, particularly mainstream literature? So genealogy is tracing the origin. It may not be historical origin, but academic origin, critical origin, book origin. Thoughts over time. How do I place these concepts so that then I can understand it within the mainstream literature, within the mainstream academia? But of course, this same concept has metamorphosized severally. In other words, it has transitioned. At what context? From which dimension? From which mainstream? From which tradition? From which framework? From which dimension are you utilizing this concept? Genealogy, tracing. Tracing means you first live the concept and understand how this concept has grown over time. And what has been the changing trend within this concept, and how, and the force, and a number of issues that forced it to change the way it has changed. If you look at the concept in itself, you've failed from the beginning because it has a context. You are not the first to use this concept. You are not the last to use this concept. And yet this concept has been used culturally, has been used politically, has been used economically, has been used linguistically, has been used in Paimol, all over. The context of Paimol and how this word has grown over time from the context of Paimol. From the context of the movement regime, how has this context grown over time? If we are talking about the concept of liberation from Ugandan context, how do Ugandans understand liberation? It may be different from the mainstream. So if you're using liberation from the Ugandan context, you also have to see that Amin used the same context of liberation. Obote also used the same concept of liberation. And Museveni has also used the same concept, liberation. But all of them emerge from different contexts. What is this context? What is this historical political trend? What is this political trend or a military trend? How can we understand to contextualize this concept? It means drawing back. Is theorizing historicizing? Is theorizing backward movements? The core of theorizing, therefore, is understood from the works of Gilles Deleuze. Gilles Deleuze talks about the idea of assemblage. We are asking the question, once we've agreed that we have to contextualize, we have to move back and forward, so that there's a back and forward movement. A pendulum, in order to understand, in order to contextualize, in order to situate, in order to give it a very particular understanding, we need to know this particular understanding is not particular. It is as in a certain tradition, as in a certain context, as in a certain history, as in a certain political domain. And so, that therefore brings us to this question, is theorizing therefore historicizing? Is theorizing therefore contextualizing? What is theorizing? We are coming closer to the point of theorizing. But we want to understand its nature, not necessarily its definition, but its nature. And to help us understand the nature, we have Gilles Deleuze. Assemblage. The analytical category, assemblage, the notion of assemblage. Now, it does not use assemblage as a concept, but as an analytical category. An assemblage is a way of thinking about the social world. As a way of thinking about the social world. In other words, the social world is an assemblage. Now, what does that mean? It means that the world is a complex configurations. Now, let me give an example. UPDF, a standalone moment. UPDF in this case becomes an assemblage. Now, let's see. UPDF has soldiers. UPDF has weapons. UPDF has technology and science, or science and technology. UPDF also has administration, administration and logistics. So, when we talk about UPDF, it does not make sense until we understand the complex configuration of UPDF. And what is that complex configuration of UPDF? UPDF is a composition, a configuration of many individuated elements. The individuated elements is you have soldiers. You cannot have a UPDF without soldiers, but you can have soldiers without UPDF. So this UPDF is a composition of soldiers, weapons, technology, administration, and logistics. The question is, when UPDF gets defeated, or if UPDF defeats, what has happened? It is not the soldiers that should be joyful. We did it, yes, you did it. But suppose you didn't have the weapons, how would you defeat? And suppose you didn't have a good technology, how would you defeat? And suppose you didn't have a good skill or skills, how would you defeat? And suppose you didn't have good logistics and administration, would you defeat the enemy? No. And so you need this assemblage is like carelessly, you can talk about a combination of many things. So much so that when you want to problematize UPDF in terms of being defeated, this is how you can problematize. How could UPDF be defeated? What is the problem? And when you get hold of the commanders are only part of the UPDF. What happened to the soldiers? And you said, yes, the command level was stupid. The command level didn't do a good work, but the command level could have done a good work. The soldiers were demoralized, so they didn't fight. The commander is excellent. The soldiers are lazy. Nothing happens. Or the commander is good, excellent. The soldiers are good, excellent, but the weapons are horrible. The bullets are not measured in a certain way, so all of them fly like birds. They don't aim the target. The poor quality of the copper, the poor quality of the gunpowder, and then the weight of the bullets, it's a featherweight, flies up like the birds. But maybe the administrators were uncharitable. Salaries were not paid 6 months. We're asking about salaries. You're telling us, don't bother us, go to fight. So who caused the defeat? You have to unravel. You cannot say UPDF caused the defeat. You have to unravel the complex configuration of UPDF to be able to understand where the particular problem is. So, to that earlier question, Gilles Deleuze would then tell us, and this has been followed by another gentleman, Manuel DeLanda, talking about the same. And Manuel DeLanda simply tells us assemblages are singularities. And they are individually unique. All that come together don't destroy their uniqueness. They come with their uniqueness into the bigger body. And so when there is a problem, you have to individuate to see particular instances and particular or singular dimensions of this assemblage to find out where the problem is, just like we've done this. So to our earlier question, what then is theorizing? Gilles Deleuze would say, theorizing is like an assemblage that has to be scattered into its singular form to appreciate the dimension from which we are coming from, not to lump everything as though it has no history, although it has no singular moment, as though it has no particularity. So theorizing is beyond concept. Concept assumes that there's a uniformity. First, in the concept itself, in the naming of the concept, and in the meaning of the concept. But if you think in the assemblage domain, you'll understand that this concept is not just a lump. It has a singular momentum from which it has to be understood. Like to understand UPDF, defeat, you got to go back. You can take UPDF as a concept. But as a concept, inside it, it has history, it has complex configurations that you need to unravel. And you can only do that when you situate UPDF within a certain framework, historical framework, political framework, administrative, and on, so that when you are talking about UPDF, you have a fair picture of the complexity around it. Concepts are not complex. Concepts are simplistic. It is simplicity because it makes an assumption that it is not complex. It is linear, you can quickly understand. Theoretically, that is not correct. Every word, every concept has a tradition, has a history, has a framework to be understood. Therefore, you cannot understand a concept until you understand the concept, the theory from which, or the theoretical frame, theoretical background, theoretical tradition from which it comes. Now, once we've done that, we want to say our approach today is theoretical framework. So what we did was to give us a theoretical or a general background to bring us to speed on the issue of theoretical framework. Now we are going to do the practical theoretical framework. And we've come to this point. Our argument is conceptual framework is limited because we cannot understand a concept, because a concept is also not value neutral. A concept is value laden. It emerges from a certain value context. It emerges from a certain historical context if we follow archaeologically. If we follow genealogically, we are saying it emerges from a certain mainstream thought, mainstream corner, mainstream tradition. Or it can also be marginal traditions. Marginal traditions are those that are, literature or discourses or narratives or analysis or analytical conversations or frames that are not within the mainstream. It is in the margin. But that which is in the margin can also be useful to understand how concepts emerge over time. Until you are able to deploy this technique which we've gone through, conceptual framework becomes limited and non-directional. And from that which we've said, we want to say that PhDs have no way out but to utilize theoretical framework, because we are looking for the philosophy in the PhD. And this philosophy is ideas. This philosophy is knowledge. This philosophy is thoughts which cannot be reduced to concepts. Concepts are limited. Without history, without frame, without tradition, without academic, without intellectual traditions. And we also say you cannot understand any concept because every concept are hinged or linked or intertwined with specific traditions, either historically, politically, economically, or academically. So you cannot say, I'm using the concept love to understand interconnections. What do you mean by love? If you're coming from the Romance tradition, then you'll understand love emotionally. If you're coming from the philosophical tradition, then we know philosophy itself is this. Philosophy, philo, is love. Philo, like I can say I philo you. It's love. But love for what? It's not emotional love. It's intellectual. It is a question of reality. Love for Sophia, wisdom. So the concept love now becomes complex and has no meaning until it is registered to a particular tradition, to a particular framework. In itself, it is not meaningful. If you are now coming from the romantic tradition, then you understand love. If you are coming from a philosophical perspective, then you understand love, or from an academic perspective. In itself, no. What does that mean? Concepts are only understandable in a theoretical frame. So, we've argued for theoretical framework. We've, in a sense, positioned theoretical framework. And that is not by coincidence. It's first of all by design, because we are looking for the philosophy in the PhD. And we cannot look at it at a conceptual, but at a theoretical framework. So that means doctoral students are then invited to consider a theoretical framework. Which theory helps to illuminate the problem you are dealing with? Which theoretical tradition illuminates the problem you are dealing with? And as Michel Foucault did say, a theory also must be investigated archaeologically or genealogically. Because theories are also not static, they develop over time. So you got to go back to the root. For example, if you are dealing with which scientific theoretical theory can we use as an example here? Yes, Apili? Which theory? Let's have a case here. ACTA. Yes. ACTA network. ACTA network. So the idea of ACTA is the idea of agency, not so? You want to see ACTA network theory. In other words, first, an ACTA is a sense of agency, that something does not just sporadically occurs or happens, it is induced. And the induction here is by either humans or something at least. So this is the question of causality. Something does not just happen, it is not deterministic, it is caused. This is causality. And that causality or causation has an implied effect. If you went back and look at Isaac Newton, for every action, there's an opposite what? Reaction. So, what that means, this causality or causation must always have effect. So, causality therefore is cause and effect. So, the core of your work is not network. The core of your work is ACTA. So a network is only the question of alliance. How do they come? How do they organize themselves? How do they create order? How do they, come together, associate? Yeah, so that then this network is almost like assembly. How do they network? How do they assemble? How is this assemblage possible? Now that is important. The question is, if we were to read ACTA or agency archaeologically and genealogy, where is the origin of this thinking about actors? It does not just emerge out of the blue. At what point did we begin to consider it was important to study agency in understanding a phenomenon? And then you begin to see that takes you up to, from an archaeological point, from the biblical story, where we are told God made it happen and it happened. There is a being who speaks and thinks, come to order. But there is also a critical approach to this, which is evolution. And what is evolution? So, the biblical story is what you would call determinism. You have nothing to do. You have nothing to offer. You have no energy to add on. It is ordered. This gets deconstructed. This gets, resisted through evolution. So evolutionary theory starts us to understand the issue of acta. And from there you can come to question of enlightenment. Enlightenment. Or what you would call the quantum mechanics. And you begin to see a move away from the idea that things are heavenly, things are divine, to the idea that things are made, things are done, things are human, humans do it. And it can not only be humans, but organisms. And the causality, the Isaac Newton's, is it third law? Cause and effect. Creates the idea of the actor. So you can follow that archaeologically to date. Where are we in terms of the evolution? Where are we in terms of the historical journey of the concept or of the idea of actor? So that is from an archaeological point. But from a genealogical point, we can choose to contextualize the origin from an academic or a scholarly. And I think you would probably, the two would be good. First, to bring yourself to speed. Over time, how has this issue evolved archaeologically? But also genealogically. And the two, as we said, entangle, they intertwine. It's very difficult to separate the two. Now, this is more historicizing. This is more intellectualizing. One is historicizing, the other is more intellectualizing. So the intellectual tradition in the understanding of the actor or agency. And here, of course, the historicizing, you can go up to the French Revolution, the idea when people said, well, it's our turn, we have to manage life, no more, and of course goes into enlightenment and so forth. Now, at the intellectual, I don't know where you start from, but I can start from Judith Butler on the concept of resisting bodies. Now, this is from social science. I don't know how you are. And it creates the idea of agency. Are we going to pray to God to help us from the bad regimes? Hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah. God help us. Watu moko, ay rodmay polo, watu moko, paimol konywan. Butler says, the great issues of the day is not going to be left to faith and fate. People must rise, people must act, people should do something. And this is the idea of agency. And so, intellectually, he writes a book and he starts talking about resisting bodies to emphasize the idea of agency. But much earlier was also Judith Butler, is a lady, was Irene Anna. She writes the book Human Condition, I think 1958, Human Condition. How she talks about vita activa. Vita activa. Vita is life. Activa is active. Active life. You are not a cabbage, you are not a tomato. You are human, active, alive. So your life is active. In other words, you must project vita activa, active life. Don't just sit and pray, don't just sit and wait, do something. There's a cartoon of a monkey who is complaining, don't just sit and do nothing. What are we doing? From the genealogical point, the intellectualizing, we are beginning to go into the origin to understand theoretically. If I'm using this agency, actor, network, from which tradition am I picking? And before I can choose a tradition, I got to go back into the mainstream literature and interact with the various intellectual process within that area. So that by the time Apili now comes to utilize this concept actor, the issue is from which theoretical tradition. Remember, we said that all the traditions are framed, all the concepts, all the ideas are framed within a certain historical framework or within a certain intellectual tradition. And when you follow the conversation between Judith Butler and Irene Anna and on and a number of people, then you begin to see which theoretical tradition appeals to you. And you use this tradition, theoretical tradition. Then you come back, said, okay, now I have something to utilize as a torch, to torch my concept, to torch my understanding, to torch my argument. And I use, so that then Apili now becomes Arendtian, because she has taken the Anna Arendt's tradition. Or Apili can become Bartolian, because you took her tradition. Or you can go to Michel Foucault, so that you are Foucaultian. Michel Foucault on love yourself. Michel Foucault talks about the idea of the self. The idea of the self. Now, the idea of the self is not a moral conversation or a moral proposition. It's a critical proposition on agency. When you love yourself, when the self is at the center, it means that you are not going to wait. You're going to do it. You are not going to wait to think through a problem. You have to think through a problem. And you create and generate yourself as an active being that is not an object but a subject. So at the end of the day, we ask ourselves, what is the theoretical tradition from which we emerge? And this is a crisis to many people. What are you talking about? Very simple. Which theoretical tradition do you come from or emerge from? Because you are journeying in the footsteps of the giants. You are standing on the shoulder of academic giants. You want to be like Foucault? There you go. You want to be like Arendt? There you go. You want to be like Butler? There you go. You want to be like Charles Darwin? There you go. You follow a theoretical tradition. Up to the dot. Why didn't you use this meaning of the concept? No. I didn't use the meaning of this concept because this is my theoretical tradition. Is the tradition analytical biology, analytical chemistry, analytical agriculture, bioagriculture, or permaculture, or primolculture? What is the tradition that occupies you academically, intellectually? And that is how you utilize to interrogate your area. Gentlemen and ladies, thank you.